Hey, good evening, everybody. I'm pretty sure that this one that I'm about to do for Christ in comic books is probably going to be my first long one when I actually give it some thought. And the reason I say that is because, if I'm correct, the last one that I did where I was actually speaking on the topic and elaborating on some of the things in relation between, of course, Jesus Christ and comic books. We're talking about the Bible and the artistic style of doing comic strips and establishing a whole story and establishing, an entire universe, putting in heroes, putting in villains, putting in civilians, and how they're impacted by those powerhouses being there. That relation, the last video that I did, I was hitting on that from the standpoint of the writers, of the authors, of those people that were transcribing, those written words. Of course, because with the Bible, those were words that were given unto the people by God to rewrite, to recite, to maintain in their heart and in their minds, to reteach unto their children. What we see with comic books, seeing as though there's a lot of people coming together, a committee of people coming together to discuss what they want to put in those comics, what kind of heroes do they think the people want to see, what kind of powers do people want to see, what would be different, what would change the platform. All of these things were taking place in both of these two different writing forms. So that's, again, that's what we're looking at this. And in this video, we're going to be looking at those two aspects by looking at it and how the universe in the writing was established. And I want to kind of start this off first by looking at it from the point of view of the comic book world first. And the reason that I want to do that, one, is because that one is extremely deep, and also it's not as if they wrote them to have a beginning first. They actually wrote them, to kind of put the story out there first. Let's put the character out there first. Let's see if the people like the hero. And with the people getting so in tune with the stories, in tune with what was present in the content, they was like, okay, now we got to go a little deeper. So they started going deeper with how they wrote these. And I want to go ahead and point out that what I did in preparation for this was I studied into a couple of videos on the Marvel Universe history as well as the DC Universe history. And I didn't go as far as, watching it from beginning to end to get from where they started to where they are now. I actually just kind of looked at it to kind of get the meat of what was happening in the beginning of those universes. I want to be honest. I want to start this off by looking at DC and then work my way to Marvel. Yes, this is me being selfish because Marvel is my passion. If I love anyone between the two of DC and Marvel, Marvel's number one. We can argue about that later. Post your comments. We'll talk about it. We can debate about that later, and hopefully I can do a video in response to that. Because, like I said, I love being able to talk about these things. So, starting off with DC Comics. DC Comics actually was surprising to look into for me, because you find out that they started it off in the sense of the one that created the universe, even in the sense of the multiverse for DC Comics, was the one known as the Presence. And for them that created DC Comics, the Presence is a different way of illustrating God. That's how they chose to write God. And even more so, just as Christianity has the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, DC Comics' version of the Presence, they have a three-part of him as well. I know there's the Hand, the Source, and the third one I can't quite pinpoint off the top of my head right now, but each had a significant role in the establishment of the DC Universe. One of which, the Source, for instance, basically established the universe itself by putting a wall up that, I guess you could say, kind of gave the shape to the multiverse for DC Comics. Now, I'll double back to the multiverse here later, but that is something significant to keep in mind also, that there is a multiverse. So with DC Comics, when we're looking at this as well, what came forth after that, of course, was the Presence began establishing, heaven. It began to establish the angels. It began to establish, of course, the planets and the things in that universe. They actually went as far as, in a way, keeping it the same with the biblical format, but also kind of deviating against it. Not necessarily, I would not go as far as to say to intentionally blaspheme or to intentionally say, the Bible's wrong and to come up with their own interpretation of God, but to really kind of give that story a bit more imagination. It is dangerous to delve into too much of your imagination, but it allowed for them to kind of do a lot of different forms of creative writing. they did maintain that the one that led to the fall was Lucifer. In DC comic books, he is Lucifer Morningstar. He did influence the 1/3 of the angels to rebel against the presence, as far as the DC Comics illustrates it, which correlates with the Bible, and they led that rebellion and they were cast out. Now, one significant difference, which of course amongst the Christian culture is something that is always being debated amongst those that are newly welcomed into Christ, is a huge question that's always asked, whether or not when the devil was cast out, was he sent to hell? Was he sent to earth? The Bible gives the interpretation in the book of Isaiah that when he was cast out, he was cast into the earth. And of course, we'll go deep into all of that later. But for DC Comics, it was illustrated that Lucifer Morningstar and those 1/3 of angels were cast into hell. So that's a perspective that I want to make sure is notated here as far as DC Comics timeline. So, of course, heaven was made. Angels were made messengers. Lucifer was kicked out. Now, in part, another portion of creative writing that took place was that there were 4, I guess you could call them deities, 4 beings that were created to represent the elements of the universe. And with these elements, did they begin to establish the different races and the different beings across the DC universe. Now, there is, of course, more to every detail of that, and that's about as far as I did go into looking into DC. Like I said, because there's so many different aspects, so many different things to take into consideration when you're looking at DC Comics and what makes the multiverse and what makes up the main universe and all of those things. To kind of touch on another aspect that I do have somewhat of a bit of a knowledge on, I do recommend, if you want, look into YouTube, because YouTube has a lot of people that go in depth into explaining different books, in depth into explaining different archetypes, different portions of the comic book universe. That could probably make you say, well, why are we going to watch you if we're going to go watch those other guys? Because I'm bringing in a new factor to consider when you are considering what things you're looking at when you go to listen to those other videos. So when we're looking at DC and we see that there is the multiverse, one thing to take into account is, in the beginning of DC Universe, they had already established their first set of heroes, their first Justice League. I think it was the Justice Society of America. It was the first name for them, the JSA. And they were like the first Justice League. And they were like older. They were of the old art style for what the male physique was supposed to look like. Even with Wonder Woman coming in and being that leading lady for, women being a powerhouse as well. They had a very old art style. So as the comic book universe began to expand, new characters began to take up the mantles for those original characters, save maybe Superman and Batman. Those are probably the only two that maintain their main person. What I mean by that is Clark Kent will always be Clark Kent. Clark Kent will always be Clark Kent. And Bruce Wayne will always be Bruce Wayne. There's not going to be someone else taking up the Batman mantle across time. Ever since the beginning, those are like the two roles that's been hardest to replace or say, hey, you can be the new Batman and we're fine with it. We as a people have not so far been fine with it, just to go ahead and say that. But one aspect that they did that allowed them to really dive into the multiverse was with the Flash, I think he was the second Flash, genuinely, and the reason I say that, I think it was Wally West. He was the second Flash. And what he did was, with him being able to run so fast, everybody that's watching this, please, I really hope you know your comic books. I'm not going to be able to speak to every character, every detail, every ability, and go into depth and all of that, at least not for, several other videos, and hopefully being able to relate those to biblical things, but I really hope you do your research on that. But to point out, so what the Flash did in this time was, he was vibrating at such a high speed that it allowed for him to cross the barrier between the universes. So it seems as though sound waves and vibrations was what is separating the multiverse from themselves, from allowing them to intermingle, allowing them to correlate. So with Flash being able to vibrate at that pace, he could cross that barrier. So when he crossed that barrier, he met one of the first Flash that was ever established, who was a part of the Justice Society of America. So there was that connection there. It's like, wait, there's more than one Flash. There's more than one way that this story can play out. That's where you see the multiverse being established. Including with DC Comics, they like to maintain with that by using the Flash, even to go as far as doing Flashpoint, which is one of the biggest hits of DC Comics history, is Flashpoint, where Flash finds out he can go back in time. He goes back in time to try and save his mom, but that changes the future, where heroes aren't always heroes. It even changed where Superman landed. Instead of landing on that farm, he landed and ended up being controlled by the government. Wonder Woman ends up trying to get with Aquaman and kills his wife, and then there's a war between the Amazons and the Atlanteans. It's crazy how they went about showing how that one instance of just saving your mom and changing your history really can change how the universe can flow. So that brought about different aspects of the multiverse. Another thing that they did, and they did this in the arc for Dark Knight's Metal, which is a Batman series, which incorporates multiple of the superheroes and villains across the universe. They did what was called I think it's the negative multiverse, which is a dark version of the multiverse, basically, where anything bad that could have happened, happened. So just to kind of simplify what the negative multiverse was. So that is my best illustration of DC Comics version of the universe. Excuse me, I did forget to mention one other aspect of that. So other deities were made, and at this point they were the old gods. The thing about the old gods was the old gods kind of illustrated how people view gods and deities and mythological beings today, where it was, people were praying to them, and if those gods were real, those gods would do something. But in DC Comics, those gods got the prayers, those gods got the worship and the sacrifices, but those gods did nothing for their people. And so what happened in the midst of all of that was someone by the name of Uxas went to cause dissension amongst those gods, which led to a war between those gods. What Uxas was trying to do was he was trying to get his hold on, in this universe, which was a very powerful set of energy. He was trying to harness that power to make himself stronger, to make himself, a higher being in this universe. And so what that caused was he ended up going to war with his brother, and in them two going to war with one another, they basically had a divide. So the older brother of Uxas, he took over one portion of their version of heaven, which is actually, it's a different dimension. This is not a different universe. It's a different dimension. So those are two different aspects. But the older brother had one aspect of it, and that's where he called that New Genesis. And Uxas took over what was called Apocalypse, and that's where you get Darkseid. And for those of you that know your comic books, Darkseid is the primary enemy of Superman, primary enemy of the Justice League. He's a big threat to the Earth itself. So he's always shown himself to be a prominent threat. And his power level is exceedingly high. Not to get into power levels, that's a topic for another video. But these are several aspects of what goes into the DC universe and what they bring into the beginning of that universe. I do apologize for not being able to speak on the establishment of, human beings, their intelligence, where did they get their powers, when did this start, when did that start, because there's so many aspects to that. One of the other things that contributes to the beginning of the DC universe is they're known as the Guardians, because of the Green Lanterns, but there's a deeper history behind them that leads up to them even becoming the Guardians, because they contributed to the beginning of the DC universe as well. So there's a lot of history there that leads up to these. Next, I want to get into Marvel. Now, I really kind of enjoyed looking into the Marvel history. In one instance, because the portion that I did know of myself was already shocking. But to see that there's more to it than even that made it even more shocking. And I guess you could say it made me ask more questions. It's like, well, what's the past behind that past? Because, so, let's begin this real quick. Let's go ahead and dive into this. So, with Marvel, what they had the sixth universe. And the sixth universe is basically your standard Marvel universe. You got Spider-Man, you got the heroes, you have human beings, you have all the planets. They're all gathered there. And what's going on in this instance is a deity wanted to wreak havoc. He wanted to be the one ahead of all things in this universe. So he began to try and harness a new power. But in him not being able to harness that power, he went and destroyed what was holding the universe together in and of itself. So in him destroying that, it caused the universe to fall apart. Now what happened after that was the Phoenix, which is a multiversal deity. I'll come back to the Phoenix and speak on that. But the Phoenix Force, which was existence at this time, went to war against that being. It defeated him, and the universe yet still was leading to its destruction. Now, separate to that of Universe 6, there was a man by the name of Galen, And Galen went with, I guess you could call them the last survivors, the ones that were trying to do their best to continue on past the destruction of the entire universe of Universe 6. But all of his companions ended up dying. Galen ended up absorbing all of the cosmic energy from Universe 6, and he ended up being put into a state of hibernation, so to speak. And what happened was a new universe was about to be born. So this universe entered into a deep sleep of some sort, and it laid in wait. And at some point, what some scientists would probably call the Big Bang, what, biblical believers would say, let there be, when God said, let there be light, two separate instances could be taken into consideration in this instance with what was taking place. But that egg that was harnessing this new universe released. It exploded, and everything began to just fall into place. The deities of this time, and I'm not talking, Odin and all of those deities. I'm not talking about Zeus. And to be honest, I'm not even talking about Yahweh. I'm not talking about God as far as Marvel goes. It wasn't as if those people just came and popped into this universe. What happened was there's eternity. There is, there's master order and chaos. There's other different deities. There's eternity, there is chaos, there is order, there is so many different ones, and I'm sorry I can't tell you all of the ones that are involved in this, but there's so many different deities that are involved in this. Even one that, as far as his appearance goes across Marvel, he only shows up when there is a universal magical threat. And we can talk about that at a different time. But he is another deity type person that shows up in Marvel that just popped out when this egg was established. And of course, we know Galen is involved here. So Galen is still in his hibernation state while all of this is taking place. So what begins to happen is Eternity starts to make little other versions. And there's more names for them. They even consider Empathy involved in this, of the I believe it's 6 of them that he made. And so he made these deities. And in them making these deities made other deities. So across the Marvel universe, what was established was that there were different creatures, different species established across different planets and landed there and placed there to just continue to exist and to be and do as they are. One of which, and I'm only referencing this because I read a lot of the Fantastic Four, and this character, the Watcher, was involved in it. But the history of the Watcher was that the Watcher and his people became extremely intelligent. They harnessed scientific advancement, and they wanted to do good by spreading their scientific advancement across the universe. And in them going to, spread that, they began to, hey, here guys, let us advance you, let us make you better, let's make this place a better place to live. And then sharing it with the different species across the universe, going from planet to planet, they noticed that several different planets ended up destroying themselves as they became more advanced. So these people decided that instead of us giving unto them, we're simply going to document everything that happens with these people. How will they, in essence, how will they advance themselves? We're just going to document, we're just going to watch. Now, the Watcher that was involved in the Fantastic Four, he was one, although he was watching them and intrigued by them, in some cases couldn't help but involve himself with them. Okay, so that's just a bit of a portion of a species and how they operated. But several different species began doing that. They began advancing in their own way. One of which that was extremely significant, and this will tie in Galen as we go forward with this, is the Celestials. The Celestials are one that did similar to the Watchers, where they significantly advanced themselves. So much so that they began to become energy in and of themselves. I think it's cosmic energy that they became. They became cosmic energy, and they had to harness this armor to sustain that energy. And they were very big and populating across the universe. They were so powerful. They were extremely, extremely, extrely powerful. So much so they wage war even against those beginning deities that I mentioned earlier, like Eternity, and all of those that exist during this time that I mentioned before. Some of them even, the Celestials, are so high in power that they are in a position with those other beings as well. So they're highly respected and highly recognized across the universe. So what they began doing was they began, advancing more of these different species and creatures and beings across the Marvel Universe, you know, establishing them, establishing something in their DNA because they were doing so many experiments on them, that they were creating these species and setting them up and watching how they advance and seeing how things flow. And what they were also doing on the offside to that was implanting eggs in the planets where those people were living so that they could birth more of themselves out of these planets. We'll get back to that. To go further with that, the Celestials even came to the planet Earth, and 3 of them began experimenting on the lives that existed on Earth. And what they were doing was they were experimenting on those called the Deviants. They were experimenting on humans, and then they began to experiment on the Eternals. These are 3 different species that began on the Earth, and some advanced, some fell due to these experiments. The Deviants, end result, they became ones that dwelled underground because they wanted to wage war against the Celestials. The Celestials minimized their species, and so they had to go into hiding. The human beings, what they did to them was they dormantized their latent abilities. That's how you get the mutants, and in some cases, that's how you get other heroes, such as Spider-Man. That's how you get the Hulk. The reason I say that is because for mutants, their abilities are established when they reach adolescence, when they're turning 15, 16, their powers kick in. For the, y'all have to excuse me, for the people like Spider-Man, Spider-Man's was triggered because he was bitten by a radioactive spider. We know that that experiment led to other people dying, but because of the latent gene in Peter Parker, he established his Spider-Man abilities. The Hulk, being hit with so much gamma rays, normally would have killed someone, caused them to explode, as we see when we see frogs being put in microwaves. But with the Hulk, what that did was it triggered his latent gene. So that's something that was established because of those Celestials and their experiments on the human beings. Now, there's another race known as the Eternals. These were ones that were, as an aspect of human beings, that began to advance. They did have some level of mutation that took place, but it wasn't so much so that they, began to reject one another or anything of that nature. It didn't get to be that bad. But they were very receptive of one another. They began to advance. They were seen almost as heavenly beings because at one point they lived in the, I guess you could say, the atmosphere of Earth. That's where they dwelled, in the heavens, so to speak. You could look at it that way. So they dwelled there. After the war, however, that the Deviants waged against them, the Eternals decided that they were going to leave Earth and go and live and be of their own accord. So they went out and they established themselves on the planet known as Titan for them. For those of you who know, in the future for that, that's where you get your man Thanos, the Mad Titan. Okay, so that's where that kind of ties in. So all of these things really, really tie in. One important aspect of the history that I want to make sure that I point out is that there are several deitic characters that existed on the earth before the human beings, came up and began to live and function as they did after all the experiments of the Celestials. Before that even came into play, there were several deities that existed, some good, some bad, others waging war against each other. You have one known as Gaia. Gaia is kind of significant, and several different races being birthed because Gaia is the mother of Thor. So she ended up being one that mated with Odin. And even before that, she mated with someone else who I guess you could say was a Christ-like figure, because in the midst of a huge war between these deities, this figure came forth. He harnessed such great power, defeated the evil ones that were waging war against them. And at the end of the story, he shoots off and fuses himself with the sun. And this guy is never seen again in Marvel Comics ever since that point. So there's several different, remnants of Christ even in these instances, but I'm not going to dive too much into that just yet. So that's how you kind of get that beginning. But after that war, there are several different instances where 2 beings were found frozen in ice that were broken free. It was a man and a woman, and this man and woman came together to produce a child. How they survived was that there was a bovine that existed amongst them who gave them milk, and this bovine fed on the ice that was present around this time. So he was feeding on the ice and feeding the people. The people then had children. That's how you get the siblings of Odin. Odin ends up mating with Gaia. Gaia has Thor. And that's how you kind of get that family being started. There's not much details that I can give you on where the other old gods at this time, such as, Horus, all of those gods. Yahweh was recognized at this point, even in Marvel Comics. They recognize him as Yahweh in the Marvel Comics. Other deities across the mythological spectrum, Zeus, all of them coming into existence and into power. These were ones known as the All Fathers. They are ones that did similar to, like I said, the old gods back in DC. They did similar to them as well, as far as how they played out in their correlation between man and the gods. Between man and gods, how the men tried to worship the gods, but the gods didn't ever do anything to interfere, help, or, go against the people, but they definitely received of their offerings. So that's how they illustrated those gods at that time. The only god that's ever been demonstrated in Marvel Comics to be one that kind of have its hands in things going on would be Odin, and even more so, as we know, it would be Thor. Thor became even more so involved because he began to fight for humans. He even fell in love with a human. So his involvement is very prevalent there in Marvel Comics. But that's kind of a starting place for that universe. The one person that I almost forgot to speak on, Galen. Do you know who Galen becomes? Galen is the one that later becomes known as Galactus, the planet devourer, the one who goes around eating planets because he has a great hunger for the energy that's involved in each planet, so he goes and feeds on those planets. So what happened with him was, in his hibernation, he has had to create a suit that would allow him to harness all the power that he possessed. And he's on par with those deities that I mentioned that came out of the egg in the beginning of this portion of the universe at this time. He's one of those on par with them. What's significant is, with him, what makes his tie-in so great is he originally was, illustrated as one that just waged war with the Fantastic Four all the time because he wanted to be able to devour Earth. Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, made a weapon that could actually kill him, so he made a deal with humanity that he would never devour their planet. So he continued to go to other planets to eat. What's so significant about Galactus, however, is Galactus brings balance to the populace of the Celestials. With him eating those planets, they're not able to be born out of those planets, even though their eggs are there. One thing to speculate, though, is he eating the energy out of those planets actually being a celestial? Is that what he's eating? So that's a very big and important question to, take into consideration. But he's an extreme powerhouse of Marvel. When he shows up, big things are about to go down. I'm just going to tell you that right now. Very few Marvel heroes have been able to stand against him or beat him. I love him, but I can't say even Spider-Man can beat him. Spider-Man can't touch him. He can't come close. You will never hear me say that often. So take it with a grain of salt that I say that about my boy Spider-Man. But that's about as big of an aspect of the Marvel Universe that I'm able to speak to kind of give you an essence of that. There's several different factors to the Marvel Universe and the DC Universe that I think I want to speak to at a later point. Like if you ever look up a Celestial, you'll find it interesting that their armor is similar to that of Iron Man's. So I think there's a correlation there that Marvel could play with in the future. I look forward to doing that one day. Y'all have to excuse me. I'm sorry that I'm hiccuping, but just got out the gym, feeling it, tired. You can probably see me glistening and sweating. I'm sorry. But anyway, to press forward with this video as we draw to a close, but this is more important. This portion is so much more important to me, not to take away from the Marvel and DC artistry, design, and creativity. But this portion is on... we're going to be looking at the Bible at this point. The Bible is one of great controversy. I don't say that for myself, per se, because when I read the Bible to look to prove it to be true, because of how much I believe it to be true in my heart already, outside of what I've already read or have not read. So, and that's not to say that I'm swayed, but that is to say that as I look into the Word, the truth of every aspect of it keeps becoming more and more real to me. But not to get too much into, as important as it is, my faith, because I want to be able to have dialogue about these things without getting overencompassed in myself. And trust me, I will be doing a video on my faith as well, but not to be overencompassed in myself. When looking at the Bible and you look at the beginning of how it was written, I already mentioned how in the Bible, in the book of Isaiah, it speaks of how the devil and his angels, the 1/3 that went with him, were kicked out of heaven and kicked into the earth. Now, although this is recognized in a later portion of the Bible, this is something that actually took place before the establishment of the actual planet. The reason I say this is because in Genesis chapter 1, it speaks of how the earth was void and without form. So the earth was present, but the earth wasn't productive. The earth wasn't reproducing anything of value. The earth didn't have anything to it. It was a nothingness that existed in the universe. So with that being that nothingness that exists in the universe, the devil was cast into that nothingness. So he was cast into the earth. Again, like I said, there is debate about whether or not the devil was cast into hell, whether hell was put inside the earth, whether hell was put around the earth. There's a great deal of debate about that. This video isn't to talk about those things, but we will talk about those things because it is important, and I think the people do need to know the significant differences. But the devil was cast into it. Following that, although as we look at in Genesis, we see that what God goes to do is he goes to look upon the earth and establish something new here. Of course, before going into the earth and to establishing itself, he established the heavens and the earth. So he doesn't just go touching the earth first and then saying, okay, let me see about establishing stars and the other planets and you know, the cosmos and the galaxies and even farther off beyond there. Let me establish those later. Those things, as far as the Bible illustrates, are already set in place. Even with the earth being void at this time, those things have already been put into place. So what God then goes and does is he goes, and I think this is so powerful here. I'm sorry to get in my feelings because I wasn't doing that too much with the Marvel and DC thing, but I'm going to tell you, it's deep how God goes into the earth to create the earth. He wasn't doing like a painter and just kind of stroking here and stroking there and just, do I like it? Do I not like it? Let me throw the canvas out and redo it. No, God was in the face of his creation. That's so powerful. God's been in the face of his creation. Because when God was, for instance, establishing the atmosphere and establishing the waters, God was present with it. He had to look upon it and see it for what it was. The waters were dark. Instead of simply trying to say, let me take the darkness out the water, he said, let there be light, which in turn, as we already know as human beings, that when the light comes on, the darkness flees. That's biblically written. That's evident in our daily lives. Whenever we cut the lights on, the darkness done ran into a corner. So the darkness has fled the waters. So there's a separation between the light and the waters. What he also goes to do is he goes to establish the firmament. Now, I am not a scholar on this material, but I do want to be able to speak to it to say that the firmament that was established is almost to say that he established the different aspects of the atmosphere. You know how we have the atmosphere, the stratosphere, and then we have the portion of the sphere of the universe of the earth that leads into space to where we ourselves can't breathe. There's a heavy amount of pressure at that point in the atmosphere. And what's really interesting is there's a heavy amount of pressure that as you reach a certain depth in the ocean, is too much for you to be able to go into. Even if you have on scuba gear, you can't go to that depth. Even if you go into a submarine, that pressure can start to crush the actual submarine. So you have to be careful when delving into these different areas of the universe. Just to kind of sidebar here, I kind of found it funny when you look at the Tower of Babel in the Bible and how God was, he was so intrigued by the imagination of mankind that they were able to come together and build that great building. But as they were building a building higher and higher and higher up into the sky, they've never reached that point in the atmosphere.